Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. Camping with friends always seemed like the perfect escape. A break from deadlines, buzzing phones, and the suffocating monotony of life. That weekend, 4 of us, me, Sam, Liz, and Andy, had ventured deep into the forest to find a secluded spot far from civilization. We didn't want picnic tables and marked trails. We wanted wilderness. And boy, did we get it. By the second night, the novelty had worn thin. The forest felt too quiet, the air too cold. Even the firewood seemed to burn reluctantly, crackling as though it resented being used. It was Sam who spotted the lantern first. "Hey, check that out," he said, pointing beyond the reach of our flickering firelight. I turned, squinting into the dark. At first, I thought it was a firefly, a faint, golden glow weaving lazily between the trees. But as it drew closer, the light sharpened. It wasn't a bug. It was a lantern, swaying gently as if carried by an invisible hand. "Probably another camper," Andy muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "At this hour?" Liz asked. Her voice carried an edge of unease that I didn't want to acknowledge. "It's almost midnight. Maybe they're lost," I offered, though I wasn't convinced. The lantern moved too smoothly, too purposefully, gliding through the dense forest like it knew exactly where it was going. "Let's check it out," Sam said, grabbing a flashlight. "Bad idea," Liz said, crossing her arms. "But curiosity is a funny thing. It burrows into your brain and won't let go, even when every instinct tells you to leave well enough alone." Against Liz's protests, the 3 of us followed the glow. The forest seemed to close in around us as we walked, the trees pressing tighter together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavy, thick with the earthy stench of moss and something else, something sharp and metallic, like blood. The lantern remained maddeningly out of reach. No matter how fast we walked, it stayed the same distance ahead, bobbing and weaving just beyond our grasp. "Maybe it's on a timer," Andy suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Who the hell sets a lantern on a timer in the middle of nowhere?" Liz snapped. When we finally caught up, the glow led us to an abandoned campsite. It was nestled in a small clearing, the ground littered with scraps of damp newspaper and rusted cans. A single tent stood in the center, its fabric sagging and stained with dark patches that could have been mud or something else. The lantern hovered above the tent, its light flickering like a dying bulb. "Looks like it's stuck," Sam said, stepping closer. "Don't touch it," Liz warned, grabbing his arm. "Relax," he said, shaking her off. "It's just a lantern." But it wasn't just a lantern. As Sam reached out, the light exploded into a scream, a raw, piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound tore through me, vibrating in my bones. Then the smell hit us. It wasn't the damp wood and mildew of the forest. It was something far worse, an acrid, stomach-churning stench of charred meat and rot. Liz gagged, doubling over. Andy stumbled back, his face pale. "Jesus Christ," Sam whispered, staring at the tent. And that's when I noticed our shadows were gone. I looked down, expecting to see the dark outline of my body cast against the forest floor. Nothing, just the pale, moonlit dirt. "Where?" Liz started, but her voice broke. "They're not gone," Andy said, his voice trembling. "Look." He pointed to the tent, and my heart nearly stopped. Our shadows were inside. They moved against the fabric, warped and distorted, but unmistakably ours. They swayed and shifted, independent of our movements, as though they were trying to escape. "What the hell is this?" Sam whispered, backing away. Liz turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in, the trees forming an impenetrable wall. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "No kidding," Andy said, grabbing her arm. The lantern dimmed, its light flickering weakly before dying altogether. For a moment, we were plunged into darkness. Then the tent began to move. The fabric rippled, bulging outward as though something inside was struggling to break free. A low, guttural sound rumbled from within, a growl, deep and primal. "Run," I said, though my legs felt like lead. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at our faces and arms. The growl followed us, growing louder, closer. I glanced back once, just once, and saw the tent collapse in on itself, the fabric pulling inward like a black hole. The shadows, our shadows, disappeared with it. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite. The fire had gone out, leaving only smoldering embers. For the rest of the night, none of us spoke. Liz sat with her knees drawn to her chest, rocking back and forth. Sam stared at the dying fire, his face blank. At dawn, we packed up and left. We never talked about it. Not to each other, not to anyone else. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel it. My shadow doesn't always move the way it should. Story 2. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. Just me, my college friends, and the untamed beauty of the forest. Josh had found the spot, a remote campsite beneath towering pines that stood like silent sentinels, their branches casting long, jagged shadows even under the midday sun. He'd been so excited, rambling about how this place was untouched, unmarked on any map. "This is the kind of place where you can really disconnect," he'd said, grinning as he dropped his overstuffed backpack to the ground. In hindsight, maybe there was a reason no one else camped here. We pitched our tents in a small clearing, the pines encircling us like the walls of a cathedral. The air smelled of earth and sap, thick and almost suffocating. But it wasn't until sunset that I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. Just silence, heavy and unnatural. That first night, I woke up to the sound of my name. Arslan. It was faint, like someone whispering from far away. I opened my eyes, my heart already pounding. The inside of my tent was pitch black, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the fabric. "Josh!" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Arslan, It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from anywhere normal. It felt like it was coming from below me. I froze, listening. The ground beneath my sleeping bag felt strangely warm, almost alive. I pressed my ear to the floor, and what I heard made my stomach churn. Voices, dozens of them, faint, overlapping, pleading. "Help us, please, we're trapped." I scrambled out of my tent, shaking. The fire had burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. Josh, Sarah, and Emma were asleep in their tents, oblivious. I didn't want to wake them. Not yet. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the stress of finals catching up to me. But then the ground moved. Not an earthquake, not a tremor. It was a slow, deliberate writhing, like something was shifting beneath the soil. I backed away from my tent, nearly tripping over a tree root. That's when I noticed something else. The pine needles carpeting the ground were arranged in strange patterns, spirals, and symbols I didn't remember seeing before. They looked almost deliberate, like someone or something had been here, marking the ground while we slept. The whispers grew louder. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was a bad dream, maybe some sleep paralysis or dehydration messing with my head. I didn't mention it to the others. Josh would have laughed it off. Sarah would have rolled her eyes. And Emma would have asked too many questions I didn't have answers for. But as we packed up to go hiking, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Emma's tent was empty. Her sleeping bag was still inside, neatly rolled, and her boots were by the flap, untouched. But Emma was gone. Maybe she wanted the stream, Sarah said, though she didn't sound convinced. Without her shoes? I asked, holding up Emma's hiking boots. Josh shrugged. She's probably exploring. Let's not freak out yet. But I was freaking out. I could still hear the whispers, faint and teasing, just on the edge of my hearing. We spent the day searching for Emma. The forest felt wrong, like it was watching us. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, a flicker of something pale and human-shaped. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. By dusk, we were exhausted and no closer to finding her. We returned to the campsite, hoping she'd show up on her own. She didn't. That night, the whispers were louder. Arslan, Sarah, Josh. They knew our names. I couldn't take it anymore. I crawled out of my tent and found Josh sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. "Do you hear it?" I asked. He nodded, his face pale. I thought I was going crazy. Sarah joined us a few minutes later, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. "It's coming from the ground," she whispered. I heard it too. We sat there in silence, listening. The voices weren't just whispering anymore. They were crying, begging. "Help us, let us out." We decided to leave at first light, but the forest had other plans. When we tried to follow the trail back, it was gone. The pines stretched endlessly in every direction, their twisted branches forming a canopy so dense it blocked out the sun. We walked in circles for hours, the whispers growing louder with every step. "Where's Emma?" Sarah kept muttering, her voice shaky. "Where is she?" We found her tent on the third day. It wasn't at the campsite anymore. It was deep in the woods, the fabric shredded and stained with something dark. Inside, we found Emma's backpack, her journal, and a single pine cone, perfectly preserved. Her journal was open to the last page. The handwriting wasn't hers. Beneath the pines we wait. By the fourth day, Sarah was gone. She'd been right behind me, holding onto my jacket to keep from getting lost in the fog that had rolled in overnight. But when I turned around, she wasn't there. Her flashlight lay on the ground, the bulb flickering weakly. I didn't call out for her. I knew it wouldn't help. Josh and I kept moving, though neither of us knew where we were going anymore. The whispers were constant now, louder than ever. They didn't beg for help anymore. They laughed. That night, I woke up to find Josh standing over me, his face pale and blank. "Josh," I whispered. He didn't respond. When I reached out to touch him, his skin crumbled like ash. I'm alone now. The forest won't let me leave. The ground beneath me shifts constantly, like a living thing. The whispers are deafening, and I can feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I don't know what they are. The voices, the shadows, the forest itself. But I know this. It doesn't want me to leave. As I write this, the pines are closing in, their branches weaving together like a cage. The ground beneath my feet is splitting open, and the whispers are screaming my name. If you find this journal, leave. Don't camp here. Don't listen to the whispers. And whatever you do, don't look beneath the pines. Story 3. Camping wasn't my idea, not this time. I'd have been perfectly happy spending the weekend on my couch with a good movie and a cold drink. But my best friend Mike had that look in his eye, the one that said, "You don't have a choice." So there I was, trudging up a rocky trail in the middle of nowhere, a heavy pack digging into my shoulders and a rising sense of dread clawing at the back of my mind. I chalked it up to exhaustion, or maybe the unease came from how quiet the woods were. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional wheeze of my breath. When we finally reached the clearing, the sun was setting, painting the sky in blood-red streaks. It was beautiful in a way, but it made the shadows seem longer, darker. That's when we saw it, a fire pit dead center in the clearing, blazing like someone had just lit it. "That's weird," Mike said, dropping his pack with a grunt. "What's weird?" asked Sarah, his girlfriend, who looked as worn out as I felt. "The fire," Mike said, gesturing. "No one's here. And look at those chairs." There were 4 of them, old wooden chairs arranged in a semicircle around the fire. They weren't just placed there randomly. They were angled like they were waiting for someone to take a seat. I reached out to touch one. It was warm, like it had been sat in just moments ago. "I don't like this," I muttered, glancing at Sarah. "Relax," Mike said, grinning. "Someone probably just left to grab more firewood. We'll hang out for a bit. If they come back, we'll move along." Sarah hesitated, but then she smiled nervously and dropped her pack. "Fine, but if we hear banjo music, I'm out of here." Mike laughed, and I tried to join in, but it came out forced. Something about that fire felt wrong, like it was watching us. We toasted marshmallows, told a few bad jokes, and tried to settle into the night. The fire crackled and hissed, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. For a little while, I almost forgot how uneasy I felt. Almost. It started with the chairs. At first, I thought the heat was playing tricks on my eyes. The chairs seemed to shudder, just a little, like they were adjusting themselves. Then one of them tipped back, creaking softly like an old porch swing. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. "See what?" Mike said, shoving a marshmallow into his mouth. Sarah froze, her eyes locked on the chairs. "It moved," she whispered. Mike frowned, glancing at the chair. "You guys are just spooked. It's the wind or something." "There's no wind," I shot back. Before he could respond, the fire flared, bright and violent, casting long shadows across the clearing. That's when we saw them, figures, just on the edge of the woods, stepping into the firelight. They were tall and thin, their bodies blacker than the night around them. And their faces, they didn't have faces. Just smooth, blank surfaces where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. They moved slowly, deliberately, toward the fire, toward us. Mike scrambled to his feet, his bravado gone in an instant. "Who the hell are you?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The figures didn't answer. One by one, they sat down in the chairs, their movements stiff and unnatural. The creak of the wood was deafening in the silence. "Thanks for waiting," one of them rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against each other. I don't remember much after that. Just fragments. Sarah screaming, Mike grabbing my arm, dragging me away from the fire. The sound of footsteps behind us, slow, heavy, unrelenting. We ran until our legs gave out, collapsing against a tree far from the clearing. The woods were pitch black, but the firelight seemed to follow us, glowing faintly through the trees. "They're not real," Mike kept muttering over and over. "They're not real," but they were. The ranger found us the next morning, huddled together like scared kids. When we told him about the fire, the chairs, and the figures, he didn't laugh or call us crazy. Instead, his face went pale. "You went to Black Hollow, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's Black Hollow?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer. He just shook his head and told us to pack up and leave. It's been 2 weeks since that night, and I haven't slept much. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The faceless figures sitting around the fire, waiting. Last night, I smelled smoke in my apartment. When I looked out the window, there was a glow in the alleyway, faint but unmistakable. They're still following me. Story 4. There were 5 of us on that camping trip. Me, my best friend Brian, his girlfriend Kelly, her cousin Sarah, and my younger brother Ethan. The plan was simple. Take the weekend to hike through Stone Hollow National Park, set up camp by the lake, and forget about the world for a couple of days. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the trail was supposed to loop back to the campground before sunset. But we never made it. The trail forked unexpectedly, a narrow, overgrown path leading into denser woods. Ethan pointed it out, swearing it wasn't on the map. None of us believed him until Brian checked his GPS and frowned. "That's weird," he muttered. "It doesn't show up here either." Kelly laughed nervously, brushing her blonde hair behind her ear. "Maybe it's a shortcut." We debated for a minute. Sarah was the only one who protested, claiming we should stick to the main path. But Brian, ever the adventurous one, insisted. "What's the worst that could happen? It's probably an old trail nobody uses anymore. The path twisted and turned, dragging us deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the fading sunlight. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of our footsteps seemed to echo. And then we saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its weathered wood dark with age. The roof sagged, the windows were smeared with grime, and the door hung slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, like it had been swallowed by time. Did anyone know there was a cabin out here? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Brian replied. He was already stepping toward it, curiosity pulling him forward like a moth to a flame. Wait, Sarah said, grabbing his arm. This doesn't feel right. Let's just go back. Back where? Brian gestured to the tangled trees surrounding us. We're already off the map. Might as well check it out. Reluctantly, we followed him. The closer we got, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It smelled faintly of smoke, though there was no sign of fire. The door creaked as Brian pushed it open, revealing a single room coated in thick, gray dust. Except it wasn't dust. I was the first to notice. I touched the mantle of the stone fireplace, and the substance crumbled under my fingers. It was lighter than dust, more fragile, and when I sniffed it, the scent hit me, sharp and acrid. It's ash, I said, my voice shaking. This is all ash. Kelly gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve. Ethan backed toward the door, muttering something about the air being too thick to breathe. Then we saw the photos. They were hanging on the wall above the fireplace, old black and white snapshots in cracked frames. At first, they looked like any old family photos, groups of people standing around a campfire, smiling stiffly. But as I stared closer, my stomach twisted. The people in the photos weren't strangers. They were us. Kelly screamed first. That's me, she cried, pointing at a woman in one of the pictures. She was right. The woman wore Kelly's favorite jacket, the one she was wearing right then. There I was in another photo, standing next to Ethan. Only, the eyes weren't quite right. The longer I stared, the more the figures seemed to change, their faces stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. Brian, we need to go, Sarah whispered. But before anyone could move, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the cabin, and then the smell hit us, thick, choking smoke. The fireplace, Brian yelled. Flames had erupted in the hearth, licking up the chimney and spreading across the walls. The photos began to curl and blacken, but not before the figures inside them turned to look at us. They moved. Oh my God, Ethan choked. They're watching us. Panic took over. We clawed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't break, no matter how hard we hit them. The smoke thickened, wrapping around us like a living thing, squeezing the air from our lungs. And then the whispers began, low and guttural, coming from nowhere and everywhere. They spoke in words I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. Stay. No, I screamed, throwing myself against the door one last time. This time, it gave way, and we spilled out into the clearing, gasping for air. When we turned back, The cabin was gone. The clearing was empty, as if it had never been there at all. No ash, no smoke, no photos. Just a dense, silent forest. We didn't stop running until we found the main trail again. When we finally reached the campground, none of us spoke about what had happened. But later that night, as I sat by the campfire, I felt something in my pocket. It was one of the photos, a charred, curling edge showing my face. But it wasn't smiling, and neither was I. Story 5. When I look back on that night, I often wonder what might have happened if I'd said no. Just a simple nah. I'm good to Jack's stupid dare, and maybe everything would have turned out differently. But that wasn't me. I never said no to a challenge, especially when the stakes were something as harmless as a swim in a lake. The four of us had been camping out at Lake Hollow, a spot miles from any road, nestled deep in the woods. Jack, Brian, and Megan were my closest friends. We'd done everything together since high school, and this trip was supposed to be a throwback to simpler times. No phones, no responsibilities, just us, the forest, and the water. The lake was beautiful that night, I'll give it that. Still as glass. It reflected the full moon perfectly, so much so that you could barely tell where the water ended and the sky began. The air was cool, but not cold, and the fire we'd built earlier still crackled faintly in the distance. It should have been peaceful, but something about that lake had been bothering me since we arrived. It wasn't anything I could explain, not the usual spooky woods feeling or the paranoia that comes with being far from civilization. It was just off, too quiet, too still. I joked to Jack that the lake felt like it was holding its breath, and he laughed, but Megan shot me a look. She felt it too. Still, when Jack dared me to take a swim, I stripped down to my shorts and waded in without hesitation. The water was colder than I expected, sending a shiver up my spine as it lapped around my ankles. "Come on, you chicken," Jack called from the shore, laughing. "Bite me." I shot back, wading in deeper. The water reached my knees, then my waist. I turned back to see Megan and Brian sitting by the fire, their faces half lit by the flames. They were smiling, but there was tension in their expressions, like they didn't really want me to go any farther. But I didn't stop. The lake was so clear I could see the rocks and weeds beneath me, as well as my reflection. I paused, staring down at myself, and something about the way the moonlight framed my face in the water caught me off guard. My reflection was smiling, but I wasn't. I froze. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a ripple in the water. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. My reflection tilted its head slightly, its grin stretching wider, revealing teeth that didn't feel like mine. I tried to step back, but my legs felt heavy, like the lake was pulling me down. The reflection didn't move with me. It stayed in place, watching, smiling. Then it started to move on its own, lifting a hand and waving. I screamed, but the sound barely reached my own ears before something cold and slimy wrapped around my ankle and yanked me under. The world became a blur of bubbles and darkness. I clawed at the water, desperate for air, but the more I struggled, the deeper I sank. I swear I heard laughter, faint and distorted, like it was coming from inside my own head. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I broke the surface, gasping for air. The shore was gone. So were my friends. Jack, Megan, Brian. My voice echoed across the water, but there was no response. I swam to where the campsite should have been, but all I found was an empty shoreline. The fire was out. The tents were gone. The lake was silent at first, save for the gentle lapping of waves. But then the whispers started. At first, they were soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but they grew louder, closer, until I could make out the words. Jack, Megan, Brian. It was their names, repeated over and over, like a chant. The voices sounded familiar, but wrong, distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. I stumbled out of the lake, my legs trembling. The air felt heavier now, thick and oppressive. The moonlight seemed dimmer, and the forest around me felt alive, watching. I turned in circles, calling out for my friends, but the whispers only grew louder. That's when I saw the footprints. They were wet, leading away from the lake and into the woods. 3 sets of them, side by side, disappearing into the darkness. My heart leapt with hope. I thought maybe my friends had gone looking for me, but the footprints weren't normal. They were too long, with too many toes, and the space between each step was too far apart, like whoever or whatever had made them wasn't human. I didn't want to follow them, but what choice did I have? The forest was darker than it should have been. The trees gnarled and twisted like they'd grown that way just to mess with me. The whispers followed me, weaving through the branches, calling my name now. Ryan. I stopped. Who's there? I shouted, my voice shaking. Something moved in the shadows ahead. A figure, tall and thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. It stepped into the moonlight, and my blood ran cold. It was Jack, or at least it looked like him, but his eyes were wrong, empty, like 2 black holes. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, and when he spoke, it wasn't his voice. Ryan, join us. I ran. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of footsteps behind me, the whispers growing louder, and the feeling of cold breath on the back of my neck. I must have passed out because when I woke up, I was back at the lake. The sun was rising, the water calm and quiet again. But my friends were gone, and their names still echoed in my ears, faint and distant, like the lake itself was whispering them. I left Lake Hollow that morning and never looked back. But some nights, when the world is still and the moon is full, I hear their voices again, calling to me from the water. And I know one day I'll have to go back. Story 6. The first thing you need to know is that the woods at night are a different world. I don't care how familiar you think you are with the trails or how prepared you are with flashlights and maps. When the sun goes down, the forest isn't yours anymore. We were on the 3rd night of a hiking trip deep in the Appalachians. There were 4 of us, me, Jason, Tara, and Will. We'd done trips like this before, but this time it felt different. Maybe it was the thick fog that lingered between the trees, or the way the forest never seemed to stop rustling, even when there was no wind. I tried to shrug it off as exhaustion. We found a flat clearing near a stream and set up our tents just as the last light bled from the sky. 2 tents for the 4 of us, me and Jason in one, Tara and Will in the other. The fire was small, but enough to keep the darkness at bay while we ate and swapped stories. Around midnight, we doused the flames and zipped ourselves into the thin safety of nylon and polyester. Jason was snoring within minutes, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made my nerves stand on edge. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, even the faint gurgle of the stream. It all felt louder, sharper, as if the forest was leaning in to listen. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but it didn't last. A rustling sound woke me, soft at first, like someone brushing their hand through tall grass. I froze listening. It could have been the wind, maybe a deer wandering too close. I wanted to believe that, but the rustling grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the random noise of an animal. It was movement. Someone or something was outside. Jason, I whispered, nudging him. He groaned, but didn't wake. Typical. The sound was closer now, circling the tent. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, but all I saw was darkness. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, and the clearing looked empty. That's when I noticed it. Our tent had moved. It was subtle at first, just a feeling. The stream, which had been to our left, was now straight ahead. The small pile of firewood we'd gathered was farther away than it should have been. And the worst part? Tara and Will's tent was gone. I scrambled out, my breath fogging in the cold night air. My bare feet sank into the damp ground as I turned in a slow circle, searching for their tent. That's when I saw it, about 20 feet deeper into the woods, partially hidden by trees. Except it wasn't their tent. It was ours. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe Jason had moved it as a prank? No, that made no sense. He was still snoring inside. And the tent, it wasn't empty. A figure crouched inside, its silhouette pressed against the fabric. The thing inside wasn't human. Its head was too large, misshapen like a swollen balloon, and its limbs were impossibly long, bent at unnatural angles. It sat perfectly still, as if waiting for something or someone. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe the shadows were playing tricks on me, or I was half asleep and dreaming. But then the thing inside the tent shifted. Its head tilted slowly, as if it had noticed me. The zipper of the tent moved on its own, sliding down with an awful, deliberate slowness. The fabric parted just enough for me to see what was inside. It smiled. The grin wasn't human, too wide, too sharp, and it stretched the fabric as if the thing had far too many teeth. The sound of the zipper was replaced by a low, guttural growl that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard on my back. The thing in the tent began to crawl out, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. "Jason!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. But when I turned back to our original tent, it was empty. Jason was gone. I ran. I don't remember much of it. Just the trees whipping past me, the sharp sting of branches on my skin, and the overwhelming sense that something was right behind me. I could hear it, that awful growl, and the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. I don't know how I made it back to the stream, but when I did, the clearing was gone. The fire pit, the tents, everything, just empty forest. I spent the rest of the night huddled under a tree, shaking and trying to stay awake. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I found my way back to the main trail. The rangers didn't believe me when I told them what happened. They said no one else had registered for the area we'd camped in. They found no trace of Jason, Tara, or Will, and when they searched the spot where our tents had been, all they found were deep grooves in the ground, like something heavy had been dragged away. I haven't been camping since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a zipper sliding open, slow and deliberate. And I remember that grin. That's when I close my eyes and pray I never see it again. Story 7. We were 4 days into our week-long camping trip deep in the forest. It was one of those trips we'd planned months in advance, a much-needed break from the grind of city life. There were 5 of us, me, Jared, Tanya, Mike, and Sarah, and so far it had been nothing but hiking, fishing, and the kind of laughter that only old friends can share. On the 4th night, everything changed. We'd set up camp near a creek. The sound of water rushing over rocks was soothing, and the fire we built was crackling just loud enough to drown out the occasional rustle in the woods. Jared had just finished one of his terrible ghost stories, and we were passing around the last of the marshmallows when they appeared. 2 figures stepped out from the trees, their movements silent, like shadows detaching from the dark. At first, none of us noticed them. Then Tanya gasped, clutching Jared's arm, and we all turned to see them standing at the edge of our campsite. They were pale, almost unnaturally so, a man and a woman, dressed in clothes that looked just a little wrong. Their jeans and jackets were outdated, faded almost to the point of being colorless. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and they didn't seem to blink. "Hey," Mike said, breaking the uneasy silence. "You guys okay?" The man nodded slowly, his movements stiff, like a puppet on strings. "Our campsite," he said, his voice soft but hoarse, like he hadn't used it in years. "A bear. Destroyed it." The woman just stared at us, her lips pressed tightly together. Jared, ever the good Samaritan, stood up and gestured to the fire. "You're welcome to join us," he said, though his voice carried a nervous edge. We got plenty of space. The man and woman exchanged a glance, then moved closer. As they approached the firelight, I noticed more details that set my nerves on edge. Their clothes were clean, too clean for people who had supposedly been roughing it in the woods. Their shoes were spotless, and their hands, no dirt under their nails, no calluses. They sat down near the fire, but not too close. The man kept his hands folded in his lap, while the woman stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. We tried to engage them in conversation, asking their names, where they were from, how long they'd been camping. They didn't say much. The man answered in clipped sentences. "Tom, a while, just passing through." The woman said nothing at all. She didn't even look at us. When we offered them food, they declined. Sarah even held out a skewer of roasted marshmallows, but the woman recoiled slightly, as though the sight of it disgusted her. "They're weird," Tanya whispered to me as we cleaned up the campsite later. Weird doesn't mean dangerous, I whispered back, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. That night, we crawled into our tents, leaving the strangers by the dying fire. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound outside seemed magnified. A twig snapping, the wind rustling the leaves, the faint crackle of the fire's last embers. I kept thinking about the man's voice, the way it sounded like it came from deep inside a cave. And the woman's eyes. There was something wrong about the way she looked at the fire, like she wasn't seeing it at all. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly with the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. My skin prickled, and I opened my eyes. They were standing over me, the man and the woman, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the tent. They were just standing there, staring down at me with those hollow, empty eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen in place. Finally, I managed to sit up, my heart pounding. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaking. They didn't answer. Instead, the man leaned down, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like nothing, like air that had been trapped in a tomb for centuries. "You shouldn't have let us in," he whispered. Then they vanished. Not walked away, not ran, vanished. One moment they were there, and the next they dissolved into thin air, like smoke being sucked into the night. I scrambled out of my tent, my heart hammering in my chest. The fire had gone out completely, and the campsite was eerily silent. I shouted for the others, waking them up one by one. "They're gone," I said, my voice trembling. "The strangers, they're gone." We searched the campsite, shining flashlights into the trees, but there was no sign of them. No footsteps, no discarded belongings. The only thing they left behind were 2 sleeping bags, perfectly laid out near the fire pit. They weren't ours. Mike unzipped one of the sleeping bags, his face pale with fear. Inside was nothing but dirt and pine needles. The other sleeping bag was the same. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. No one had an answer. We packed up camp before the sun came up, hiking back to the car in silence. None of us spoke about the strangers, and none of us have spoken about them since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about their faces, their pale skin, and their empty eyes. And I wonder, where did they come from? What were they? And most importantly, what would have happened if we hadn't let them in? Story 8. It started as a quick trip for firewood. Just me and my hatchet, trying to beat the sunset before the cold set in. The others were back at camp, chatting and joking like we didn't have a care in the world. I told myself it was just another camping trip, another weekend in the woods. Nothing special, nothing strange. But the forest had other plans. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I didn't realize it right away. Not until I'd walked far enough from the campfire that their voices were just murmurs in the distance. That's when it hit me. No birds, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I told myself it was fine, just the natural quiet of the woods. I kept walking, letting my boots crunch against the dried leaves, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. The trees were massive, towering giants with twisted roots that clawed at the earth. Their bark was dark and rough, peeling in strips that reminded me of old wounds. I don't know when I first felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, scanning the shadows between the trunks. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I shook it off and kept moving. I found a good-sized branch on the ground and bent to pick it up. That's when I saw the first one, the face. It was carved into the trunk of a nearby tree, about eye level. I almost laughed at first, thinking it was just some camper's prank, a piece of amateur art scratched into the bark. But as I looked closer, I realized how wrong I was. The face wasn't a simple carving. It was detailed, impossibly detailed. I could see every wrinkle, every line of anguish etched into the wood. Its eyes, God, those eyes seemed to stare straight through me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the branch. A chill swept through me, and I glanced around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. That's when I saw another face, and another, each carved into the trees around me. They were everywhere. I turned in a slow, horrified circle, my breath catching in my throat. Every tree had a face, some with mouths twisted in silent screams, others with expressions of sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. The faces were watching me. I could feel it. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the shadows and the flickering light of the setting sun were playing tricks on me. I took a deep breath and started walking back toward camp, my arms loaded with firewood. But the faces followed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the shadows, a trick of the light. I'd glance over my shoulder and swear the expressions had changed. One face that had been crying now looked furious, its wooden lips curled back in a snarl. Another face seemed to lean closer, its eyes narrowing as if it was studying me. And then they moved. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. One of the faces turning to watch me as I passed. The wood creaked softly, the sound like knuckles cracking. I dropped the firewood and bolted. The forest came alive around me. The trees groaned and whispered, their voices low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My boots pounded against the earth, but no matter how fast I ran, the faces were always there, looming out of the shadows, their eyes burning with something ancient and terrible. "Stay," a voice whispered, soft and pleading. I froze, my heart hammering. The voice didn't come from behind me or ahead. It came from everywhere. "Please," another voice joined in, this one trembling with sorrow. "Don't leave us." I turned in circles, desperate to find the source, but all I saw were the faces, their mouths now moving, their wooden lips forming words I couldn't comprehend. "Stay with us," they begged in unison. "If you leave, you'll regret it forever." The air grew colder, sharp as knives against my skin. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like claws. I ran again, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The voices grew louder, more desperate. They screamed now, a cacophony of rage and sorrow that echoed in my skull. I tripped and fell, my hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. When I looked up, the faces were there, inches from mine, their eyes filled with an unnatural light. "Stay," they roared. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my legs burning, my lungs on fire. I don't remember how I made it back to camp. One moment I was surrounded by the faces, their whispers and screams pressing in on me. And the next, I was bursting into the clearing where my friends sat around the fire. They looked up, startled, as I stumbled into their midst, panting and wild-eyed. "Dude, what happened to you?" one of them asked. I tried to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. I turned back toward the woods, half expecting to see the faces peering out at me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just trees and darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring into the blackness, waiting for the faces to return. They never did, but I can still feel them watching. Even now, weeks later, in the safety of my apartment, I feel their eyes on me. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, twisted, anguished, and hungry. They wanted me to stay, and part of me wonders if I should have. Story 9. I'll never forget the way the map looked when we found it in the ranger's cabin. It was old, yellowed, the edges curled like it had been sitting there for decades. A red marker had been used to circle some of the well-known trails, but there was one that wasn't on any modern map. It wasn't marked with a name, just a faint pencil line leading to a clearing deep in the woods. "Look at this," Sarah said, tracing the line with her finger. Her enthusiasm was infectious, as always. "This spot could be perfect for camping. No one will be out there." I should have said no. I should have trusted the sinking feeling in my gut. But instead, I nodded like an idiot. "Sure, let's go off the grid." It was me, Sarah, Tyler, and Dan. We were college friends, the kind of group that felt inseparable, even though we all knew life would probably pull us apart after graduation. This was supposed to be one last adventure before the real world swallowed us whole. The hike started off normal enough. The trail was narrow but manageable, weaving through dense trees that towered above us like cathedral spires. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional chirp of a bird. It wasn't until we reached the clearing that things began to feel wrong. It was beautiful at first glance. The grass was a lush green, untouched by human hands. There were wildflowers blooming in bursts of purple and yellow, and the sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks. But the moment we stepped into that clearing, everything went silent. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. "Guess we found the perfect spot," Dan joked, though his laugh was forced. We set up camp quickly, trying to shake off the weird vibe. The silence was unsettling, but we chalked it up to the remoteness of the area. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a fire and started sharing ghost stories. It felt good, normal, even though the silence pressed in like a weight. It wasn't until midnight that things took a turn. I was the first to notice the trail was gone. One moment, it was there, a faint path leading back to the ranger's cabin. The next, it was a wall of thick brambles and twisted branches. "Guys," I said, my voice shaking. "The trail, it's gone." Tyler laughed, but it was hollow. "Very funny. Did you wake up early to set this prank up?" "No," I snapped, my pulse quickening. Look for yourself." Sarah grabbed a flashlight and pointed it toward where the trail had been. The light barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough to show the truth. The way back was completely blocked. "Okay, so we got turned around," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We didn't get turned around," Sarah whispered. Her voice was almost drowned out by the crackle of the fire. "Something's not right. We decided to wait until morning to try and find our way back. It seemed like the logical thing to do. But as the night dragged on, logic seemed to bleed out of the world. The first to disappear was Dan. He had wandered off to pee, grumbling about how creepy the woods were. He'd taken a flashlight, but the beam of light vanished into the trees. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When he didn't come back, we started calling his name. "Dan!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. Nothing. Just that eerie, crushing silence. We decided to search for him, sticking close together. But as we moved through the clearing, the darkness seemed alive. Shadows stretched and shifted, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. That's when Tyler vanished. One moment he was behind us holding a flashlight. The next he was gone, the beam of light flickering on the ground where he'd stood. "Tyler," I called, my voice trembling. "This isn't funny." No answer. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to leave. Now. There's nowhere to go," I whispered. "The trail's gone." We stumbled back to the fire, the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. Sarah sat down, pulling her knees to her chest. I could see the fear in her eyes, and I knew it mirrored my own. "I don't think they're coming back," she said. Her words sent a chill down my spine. As the fire began to die, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling us. "Dan," I called out, though I knew it wasn't him. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the crackle of the dying fire. Then, from behind me, I heard a whisper, "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but there was no one there, just the trail. It was back, clear as day, as though it had never disappeared. "Sarah, look," I said, pointing, but Sarah was gone. Her chair was empty, her sleeping bag untouched. I was alone. I didn't think. I just ran. The trail was back, and I wasn't going to waste the chance to escape. The brambles scraped at my arms, and the shadows seemed to reach for me, but I didn't stop. When I finally burst out of the woods, the ranger's cabin was just ahead. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. "Help!" I shouted. "My friends are missing." The ranger looked up from his desk, his face pale. "You went to the clearing, didn't you?" I nodded, trying to catch my breath. He sighed, pulling out the map. "That trail doesn't exist anymore. It was closed off years ago, after too many people disappeared. But it was on the map." I protested. The ranger shook his head. "That map's been here for decades. The trail shouldn't have been there." I looked at the map again, and my blood ran cold. The trail was gone. I never saw my friends again. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers calling my name, begging me to come back. But I never will. Story 10. I never believed in the supernatural, not until that night. It's easy to dismiss strange things when they happen to someone else, but when they happen to you, when you can't explain them, no matter how hard you try, it's a different story. I learned that lesson on a weekend camping trip that turned into the worst nightmare of my life. It started as a typical camping trip, the kind you plan for months, the kind you tell everyone you're going to have. My friends and I, Jared, Marcus, and Emma, had picked a spot deep in the woods near a small, quiet lake. We wanted a weekend away from the noise of city life, the distractions, and the people. Just nature and the sound of our laughter around the campfire. We had set up camp around 3 p.m. The sun was still high, casting golden beams through the towering pines. The air was warm with the promise of a peaceful night under the stars. As the evening came, we gathered firewood and started a campfire, the crackling flames flickering in the growing darkness. It was Jared who first noticed the fog. He was sitting by the fire, poking at the logs, when his voice, low and uncertain, cut through the silence. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, his eyes narrowed against the night. I looked up, expecting to see something trivial, maybe a deer wandering through the trees, or a raccoon scavenging in the distance. But no, what I saw sent a cold chill straight through my veins. A thick fog was creeping in from the far end of the campsite, rolling across the ground like an army of ghosts. It was moving fast, too fast for something natural, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to consume us. "It wasn't here a minute ago," Marcus said, his voice laced with unease. "We'll be fine," Emma reassured us, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "It's just fog. Happens all the time." But the fog wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't just creeping in. It was suffocating, swallowing the entire area with unnatural speed. The trees around us began to fade into the mist, their outlines blurring until they were nothing more than shadows. The firelight barely cut through the fog now, casting a dim, eerie glow that seemed to stretch too far, too thin. The warmth from the fire evaporated into the cold, and suddenly the air was thick with a kind of heaviness that made it hard to breathe. "Maybe we should pack up," Jared suggested, his voice shaking slightly. "This feels wrong." "We're fine," Emma insisted. She stood, brushing her hands together, as if to dispel the strange sensation in the air. But her voice had an edge to it now. Even she was beginning to feel it. Then it happened. From the edge of the mist, I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another shadow in the fog. But then the figure became clearer, darker against the gray haze. A man, standing perfectly still, watching us. He was tall, his silhouette sharp against the nothingness around him, though his features were obscured by the thick fog. He wasn't moving, wasn't even breathing, it seemed, just standing there like a monument to something I couldn't name. We called out to him, "Hey, you all right?" Marcus's voice broke through the silence, but the man didn't respond. He didn't even twitch. "Maybe he's lost," I suggested, though my voice was shaky. "I don't know. This is weird," Jared said, standing up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Should we go check on him?" I felt a growing sense of unease, but against that mounting fear, there was a strange pull to the figure. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I needed to know who he was, what he wanted. So, we all stood, and with the fog closing in around us, we walked toward the figure. The closer we got, the colder the air became, A bone-deep cold that sunk into your skin like the fog itself was laced with ice. The man didn't move an inch. His presence felt wrong. It was as though he was made of the fog itself, a part of it, but separate at the same time. His clothes were ragged, his arms long and thin, his hair wild, but his face was completely blank. Smooth like a mannequin's, not a single feature. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an empty mask where a human face should be. That's when I stopped. My feet rooted to the ground as if something was holding me there. "Hello," Emma called again, her voice cracking. The man didn't react. But when I took a step closer, when I was about 5 feet away, he moved, not like a human. There was no shifting of muscles, no steps taken, but as if the space between us bent. One moment he was standing still, the next he was standing closer, right in front of me. The fog thickened around him like a shroud, and his featureless face loomed above mine. I felt a cold breath on my skin. "What the hell?" Jared whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was locked in place, as if my body had forgotten how to function. Then, in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but cold and unrelenting, the man spoke. "Stay with me." The words weren't words at all. Not really. They were like an echo inside my head, a command, a plea, a warning. My heart pounded as the fog wrapped tighter around us. The world around us seemed to be closing in, the trees lost, the campsite gone. All that was left was him and the suffocating gray. Without warning, the man vanished. He wasn't there anymore, but I still felt him, his presence pressing in on me from all sides. The fog swallowed him whole, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. There was something wrong with the air, something wrong with the way the world felt now. A hand touched my shoulder. I didn't need to turn to know it wasn't one of my friends. The chill that ran through my spine wasn't from the cold. It was from something far deeper. It was a touch that wasn't meant for me, a hand that didn't belong to a human. I whirled around, but the hand was gone. When I looked back, my friends were gone too. The fire had gone out, leaving only a cold ring of ash. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence and the fog that seemed to hum in the darkness. "Guys," I called, my voice breaking. No answer, just the thick fog pressing against my chest. I stumbled through the mist, calling their names, but nothing responded. Not the wind, not the trees, not even the faint rustle of wildlife. It was as though the world had been swallowed whole. The fog didn't just obscure my vision, it consumed everything. Time, sound, space. I don't remember how long I wandered through that void. Hours? Days? But I remember this, the man, his voice, and his hand on my shoulder. It was a touch that seemed to come from a place far older than the woods, from somewhere beyond this world. I woke up at the edge of the lake. The fog was gone. The sun had risen, but there was no sign of my friends. No trace of the camp. Only a faint, lingering chill in the air, and the faintest echo of a voice in the back of my mind. I never went back to that campsite, and I never will. I don't know what happened to them. I don't know what that man was or why he called to me. But I know one thing for sure. He's still out there, in the fog waiting. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, if the fog rolls in too fast and the world goes still, just remember this. He's not lost. He's waiting for you.